So without further ado, we are so honored, we are so privileged to have Mr. Shay Assad here with us this morning. Shay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Al.
Oh,
I appreciate it. Perfect. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. You know, I think this is a great event. You know, pricing really is the foundation of an effective and capable contracting workforce. If you can't do pricing and understand pricing, then the reality is we're not going to be very effective for the taxpayers. I'm going to talk about a few things today. One is I'd kind of like to let you know where the Secretary is coming from, what his priorities are, and what he is telling all of us. Right? First of all, he's telling the entire workforce, you need to be focused on doing whatever you can to increase the lethality of our fighting force. Whatever role you play in the Department of Defense needs to be focused on doing your job such that we can increase the lethality of the force. That is the number one objective of the Secretary. The second is to foster existing international relationships that we have with our partners who go to battle with us on the battlefield, our allies, and to foster new relationships whenever we can so that we become an effective, interoperable fighting force, for goodness. And the third is he wants us to reform our business practices in order to, as he says, respect every taxpayer dollar that we spend. Right? Those are three straightforward goals, objectives, and we're all focused on it. And you heard Al talk today about innovation. Well, it's all about innovation these days because we're doing some remarkable things in the Department of Defense as we move forward. And some of it has been with the assistance of Congress, for which I'm very grateful. You know, we've gone to them with, for example, in the world of FMS, we asked them for a pilot authority in order to reduce TINA requirements. Right? One of the and this is where innovation comes along, right? We want to change the landscape in a big way. Right now, when you hear about people talking about this thing called procurement administrative lead time, right? The reality is we've been talking about PALT since 1976. I see Len Vincent smiling in front. He knows that we've been talking about that forever, right? Well, we're going to do something about it. But what we're not interested in doing is changing 400 or 500 days that it takes to do something to 475 days, right? What we really want to get to is changing 400 or 500 days to 30. And so we're getting ready. In fact, it'll probably go out today. We're going to be issuing a new policy within the Department of Defense that is going to be encouraging contracting officers whenever they can, when they're looking at a follow-on procurement, to negotiate options for usually 2 years, right? So that we get into a battle rhythm of instead of doing annual procurements, right? Every year we're kind of going through this process. Companies are submitting proposals, and the companies in this room know it. That costs money. It's called bid and proposals, right? It's like gold within a company. You only get so much of it, and if you exhaust it, you got a real problem in a company. That means they have to pass up business opportunities that they might otherwise go after because they just can't afford to submit the proposals. So where we want to go, and this is where the innovation comes in, where we want to go is we want to say, no, we'd like to get a proposal for the instant year. And then we want to take that information, and whether it be modeling techniques, pricing techniques, whatever it is that the contracting officer and his industrial partner, if you will, come up with, they develop a practice that says, okay, we're going to take that data and we're going to negotiate not just the instant year, but if we think we got a decent deal, we're going to negotiate the next 2 years. So that we've got priced options available in our contracts that we can just execute. And for FMS, what we're trying to do is say, look, you don't have to have a defined FMS requirement. We want you to put the options in the contract for undefined FMS customers, so that if an FMS customer comes along and he wants to buy a particular product or she wants to buy a particular product, it is available, it is priced. Because right now, as many of you know, we get into a mode of typically using undefinitized UCAs, undefinitized contractual actions, right, to get FMS work underway. Well, we don't want to do that anymore. It's wasteful, it's costly, and it just administratively, it's not a process that neither the government nor the company wants to be in. So this is a huge sea change for us, right? We're telling our contracting officers, look, we want you to expand your horizon. And here's where the innovation comes in, because there's an element of risk to this, both for the companies involved as well as the government, right? Because we're gonna take that single year data, and we're now going to say, okay, we're pricing 2 years out with that data, right? And so that means that we both have to feel comfortable that what's being forecasted is in fact where we're going to end up. Right? And so we're going to not only are we encouraging our contracting officers and our pricing professionals to use these techniques, but we also want our contracting officers to use more FPI contracts, right? Because it means we're taking on more risk. Right? And the companies are taking on more risk. And so we'll share it. And to the degree there's a benefit, we'll share in that too, and that's okay. Right? But it's where we are going as a department. We're going to get into a battle rhythm on major weapon systems and on major procurements of doing these once every 3 years. We're going to get out of the annual procurement cycle that we find ourselves in continuously. And that's why a conference like today is so important, because we need new and fresh ideas on how to deal with that environment. What is the appropriate way to provide a range pricing? What is the appropriate way to use variable quantity matrices? How should we be looking at fixed and variable cost and how they change so that we both feel comfortable with what we're doing? How should we be looking at actual costs, not only from the prime, but more importantly, from the subcontract community? You know, it is all about the subcontract community in many, many ways, right? The landscape has completely changed. It used to be 20 or 25 years ago where many companies would have the capability to effectively manufacture most of what went into the products they were selling right within their own facilities. They had their own machine shops. They did their own printed circuit boards. They populated those boards. They did all the sub-assemblies. They did the harnesses and cables. And then they assembled it all into sub-assemblies and then main assembly. That no longer happens. Most of our primes, for the most part, are assembling the products built by a number of subcontractors. Right? Now, it doesn't make it any easier. It's still sophisticated integration and assembly. It's not that it's a simple task, but it is a different kind of task. And the cost structure of what we buy is very different. Now, when I talk about learning about cost, I want to distinguish between commercial items and military items, right? Janice Muskoff is here. She is the chief of pricing for AFMC, but the reality of life is I consider Janice my de facto deputy for pricing for the Department of Defense. That's the reality of it. And there's nobody more qualified to talk about pricing than her. So listen to what she has to say. But where we want to go is we want to make sure that in this commercial pricing world that we're paying a fair price. And a fair price really is established. It's pretty simple. We're going to pay what other people pay. Quantity and time adjusted. That's what we want to do. The challenge for us is when we have items which are unique to the Defense Department. This term called a commercial item. It's a unique environment because in a number of instances, those commercial items haven't been sold to anybody. And yet they qualify as a commercial item. So again, innovation, using different techniques to assist us both so that the companies who are selling the products get a fair price for their product, and we, on behalf of the taxpayers, do what Secretary Mattis said, which is respect every taxpayer dollar that we spend. Right? That's the goal here. Right? We need to respect our taxpayers. You need to make a fair return for your shareholders. There's no reason why those two things should be opposed to one another if we're working together. Right? Because we do want a financially healthy defense business. Defense industrial base. It's critical to the nation. Right? And so we want that to happen. We have no interest in creating an environment where this is not a good business for companies to be in. We want them to be financially healthy. On the other hand, we also want to respect every dollar that we spend. And we want to spend it wisely, and we want to be able to look at Secretary Mattis. You know, the wonderful thing about Secretary Mattis, I worked with him in the Marine Corps, is pretty comfortable in saying this. He really does think $10,000 is a lot of money, right? And so, most Marines do. And so it makes for, when he says respect every dollar, he means it. And I think he thinks that's probably about all he has to say about it, and I agree with him. Right? We understand that. And so innovation is going to be so important because we want to get to a place where we're submitting, or companies are submitting proposals to us within 60 days. And that those proposals can actually be audited, and we can actually do our job within 60 days or so we can get to the table and get these things done. Right? That's where we want to be. So the reality of life is cost and pricing data as we presently know it, certified cost and pricing data, it needs to change. I mentioned the supply chain. If you're a major company, let's say you have a $1 billion procurement for which you are submitting a proposal, and you have two major subcontractors who are, let's say they're proposing somewhere between $50 and $100 million to you. The reality is those companies that are preparing proposals for $50 or $100 million are going to take about as much time as the prime is to put together their proposal. So that means the prime has very little time to analyze that subcontracted base. And so we get into this never-ending circle of receiving proposals with inadequate subcontract proposals, and most of the time inadequate or incomplete or missing analysis. And it's not because the company doesn't want to do it. It's because of the requirement, the vastness of what we're asking for. So we're going to ask our contracting officers to think about it in three dimensions, right? The most important dimension, and I'm talking about military items, sole source. I'm not talking about commercial items, and I'm not talking about items where companies are in competition. Because in either of those two cases, in the commercial items, we're happy to pay what the commercial marketplace pays for a particular item. It is what it is. And in a competitive environment, we're okay with letting the commercial, typically with letting the marketplace determine what the price is, right? We're talking about military sole source items. What we're telling our contracting officers, get the actual cost. Get the actual cost. Now, does that mean that they have to get every single dollar accounted for? No. What it means in the first blush is, look, we negotiated a price of $1,000. What did it cost to produce for you to do the work? Well, it cost me $875 or $900. Well, if you negotiated a profit of around 10%, then that's probably, it gives the contracting officer a sense of, you know what? They probably have a reliable estimating system. Sounds like things are okay. On the other hand, if we negotiated $1,000, the actual cost was $20 or $200, then that probably says something went wrong. Or if it was a $1,000 negotiation, it cost the company $2,000, something's wrong, right? And so we got to figure that out. So where we want to go with cost of pricing data is say, look, get the actual cost. And then figure out if there is variation. We define in a firm fixed price world, variation is 3 to 4%. You know, if it's beyond 3 to 4%, you need to understand it. Because the reality of life is that all the companies that we do business with are expected to do the best for their shareholders. So they're going to try to improve on that cost performance. That's appropriate. It's perfectly acceptable. But there's a limit to it, right? We ought to be able to forecast where we think that range should be. And then the second element of pricing data, I'll call it determinative pricing data. It's important. It's going to enable you to understand, and here's where the innovation comes in. It enables you to understand what should it cost based on that actual data that I have. What should these products be costing me? And then there's that third circle. I call it the nice to have information. It's useful, but it's not determinative. And that's what we want to get away from. Because right now, we have a one-size-fits-all cost of pricing data definition. And where we want to go is we want to be in an environment that says, no, we'd like our contracting officers and our pricing professionals to examine the data they have, sit with their brothers and sisters from DCAA and DCMA, and the industrial team involved, and say, okay, what's the data set? Here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to negotiate a cost that's reliable, enables you to make a fair and reasonable profit, but it's something that isn't going to surprise either one of us at the end of the day in terms of what our expectation was. And our plan, where we'd like to be, is contracting officers would come to that agreement with a company up front. They'd sign an MOA, 1 page, and that would be the cost and pricing data that the company has to submit. There would no longer be, everything over $2 million, no matter whether you think it's determinative, whether it's important. No, we want to get out of that mode. So we've asked Congress to enable us to conduct pilots in this regard. And for FMS, they've actually already given us the authority. And for U.S., it's included in the Senate's version of the NDAA. And while we can't presuppose what will happen, I'm hoping that when they go to conference, that pilot for U.S. requirement will be acceptable to both sides of Congress, because that is how you change remarkably the way you're doing business. We want to redefine that data set, because the reality is companies for significant proposals, and I'll say $50 million and above, they just cannot meet that 60-day time frame with the definition of cost and pricing data as we presently have it. And frankly, I don't think it's necessary. So where we want to go is we actually want to rely on contracting officers and pricing professionals to think, to use their judgment. And where we're going with this is that the level of approval for the contracting officer, if it's below $50 million, it'll just be the next level up. If it's his branch chief or whoever it might be. If it's above $50 million, it'll be the chief of the contracting office. Right? And that's where it'll stay. So that's the vision. That's where we want to go. That's what we want to do. And that means that this whole community is going to have to think very differently than they have thought in the past. Because it's going to be all about what's relevant, what's important, what's to the heart of the matter. And then how do we use that information and project it forward, typically for a 3-year period. And no, we don't want a proposal for the base year and 2 more years. We just want a proposal for the base year. And we're going to figure out together how we price years 2 and 3. That's a very different paradigm for everybody. That's should be a lot less costly for companies. And it should enable us to make a significant sea change in time. And I will tell you, we've run several pilots to date, and it is remarkable in terms of the improvement that we've seen. I think the lowest amount of reduction in PALT has been 175 days. In one particular case, it took us 900 days to negotiate a contract with a company. And the reason is because we couldn't get the actual data. And we kept saying, we want the actual information. And the company kept saying, well, we don't think we need to provide it. We said, oh, yeah, you do. Right? Give us the actual information. Ultimately, the company provided that information. We ultimately came to an agreement. And then what happened? We were able to negotiate a follow-on 5-year contract in 7 days without a proposal. And so that's where we want to go. Right? That's what we want to do. What I'd like to do is, if I could, Frank, I'd like to open the floor up for any questions that people have, because if there are areas of pricing or just things in general in contracting, I'd be happy to answer them. So Al, I'll kind of open up the floor, and we'll see where we go from there. Then you can shut me down when you want me to leave.
No, you stay all
How's
day,
that?
Mr. Assad. Hold on. I'll read them for you.
All right, that's fine, yeah.
I'm having a hard time reading some of the writing myself. So
Okay.
So listen, this is an opportunity for you all really to really ask your questions that's been burning on your hearts for a while. So please, you have cards there at your tables. So just go ahead and write your question, and you have the Q angels who are coming around. So here's a few, Mr. Assad. So in regards to the memo on sweep data, dated June 7, 2018, do you plan on having contracting officers request certified cost of pricing data in conjunction with the start of negotiations and not the end? So any data sweeps can be done while negotiations are happening, even though changes in the negotiation can affect change in the cost of pricing data.
Yeah, the reality is that contracting officers shouldn't have to request the data. It's the company's obligation to provide the data. And I'm just going back to those times when I used to sit across the table from a guy named General Frank Anderson, right? And provide information on a routine basis. It was the company's obligation to update that data, and we called it a statement of position, and provide it to the government, right? And so the problem that we've gotten into is we've kind of lost sight of what the obligation is. The obligation is the companies to submit whatever information that they have, factual data, that is that could affect the price. They need to provide it. Right? And what we got into a mode of is, to your point, Al, well, some companies said, well, you didn't request it. Well, that's not the issue. I'm not supposed to request it. And a sweep was non-existent. In those days when we didn't have ERP systems and we didn't have very sophisticated systems that many companies have available to them today, what would happen? A company would be at the table. I would be at the table. I'd be negotiating with a government contract negotiator. And, you have a sense of when you're coming to the end of things, right? When you're getting close. And so typically I'd go back to our procurement organization, program management, and say, look, we're going to wrap this up in the next couple of weeks, so I need to know if there's any more information that you have that we need to provide the government. And that's kind of how it happened. And then once we settled up, we signed a certificate, and typically that was done within 2 to 3 days of negotiations. And so we got out of that mode. And if we're all serious about getting things done a lot quicker, and I know we are in the Department of Defense, it is a partnership. It is a two-way street. So we need industry to do its job, which is give us the data. Because what we're telling contracting officers, we are not going to renegotiate these deals once we got them done. If cost or pricing data comes in after we've gotten the agreement settled, we're going to live with the deal we got. We're going to sign that contract, and DCAA and DCMA are going to go figure out what to do with that data. So companies need to get back into a mode of being more responsive to their obligation. And that means in the supply chain that you're talking to your supply chain, right? But I think we got a little lazy, right? We as a community, we got a little lazy. And the laziness was, well, we'll come to an agreement with whatever data we have, and then we'll sweep it and provide it in, right? That's not the way it's supposed to work. And so Ms. Lord is asking us as a community to do whatever we can to improve procurement administrative lead time. And we've gotten to a point where sometimes it would take a company 90 days. And that's just not acceptable, right? The reality was you were supposed to provide the data before we came to an agreement.
All right. So, Mr. Assad, I hope we have a few minutes.
I do. Yeah, I do.
We have about 100 questions.
As long as you can just throw me off the stage.
That's all good. So,
because I think, by the way, look, this is an important community. This is really an important community. And if we don't get this right, we have a unique opportunity to change the way we are doing business. And a number of the tools that are available to us now, we have to take advantage of those tools. And the innovation that Al's talking about, we really need to do it.
So here's a question: that does this mean there will be a change to the FAR definition of certified cost of pricing data, in your opinion?
If we get the statutory change from Congress, that is the statutory ability to run the pilots, and those pilots are successful, then I believe, yes, we will request that the definition of cost and pricing data change, and that it be described, the environment be described just as I just described it to you. But what Congress will want to see is that it actually works. Right? So our intention is absolutely to change the statutory definition or to request Congress to change it if, in fact, the pilots that we're hopeful that they'll enable us to do are successful. Now, if they're not successful, we won't. Because I believe that changing the cost and pricing data level from 500,000 or 750,000 to 2 million, we're going to make 1,100 days become 1,992. That's not what we're trying to do. Okay.
How will this new method work with services that could fluctuate in demand during a 3-year period? With regards to actuals, they may not be a good indicator for what's to come in explaining a variance.
Well, that's why you folks are going to have to come up with some very innovative techniques. You're right? It could be that there are some environments that will have to be priced very differently than other environments, because you may have a very, very fluid environment. And if you have that, then you're going to have to approach it differently. So this isn't going to be you all got to do it one way. It's going to be, we're going to use our collective, innovative, intelligent, responsible insight to say, how should we do it? And if it doesn't work in some environments, it won't work. But it really is going to be up to the community. And I would suggest that the services community, pricing services, they need to think this through and come forward with, hey, here's some approaches that we think would work in this environment. We got it. What you're trying to do is do this in a multiplicity of, or in a more efficient and effective way, so that we don't have to do this on an annual basis. And so we're going to be very open to industry's view on how to go about this.
Mr. Assad, please provide your opinion of when and how a non-traditional defense contractor waiver should or could be used, and also how frequently do you see this used?
Well, if we're dealing with a non-traditional defense contractor, the thing that I've found very interesting about most non-traditional defense companies is they're very transparent. They're very easy to work with. I mean, they really don't have a problem with sharing information with you and describing how it is that they've come about pricing whatever particular product or service they're trying to price. It's just different. right? And that's where we, the government, need to become a lot more agile. Right? We need to recognize that, for example, I have to tell you that I have spent on a number of different occasions days at different major commercial companies with their CFOs. And when they describe how they account for things and how they actually collect costs and what they do, in many, many ways, it's very similar to the companies that we do business with. They just use different tech. They use different terms. They use different methodologies to allocate indirect expense, or in some cases, some direct expenses. And so you just need to understand it. So I think that we don't need to go down the path of with non-traditionals, because most of the time, those non-traditionals, for example, we have a number of OTAs today where companies, non-traditional companies, are sharing cost, right? And what I mean by that is they're doing some type of a prototype project, and they're bearing the cost of those projects to a certain degree. And so I haven't yet found a problem with a company saying, well, this is kind of how we're going to describe our actual cost to you, and us saying, no, we can't live with that. So I just don't see it as a problem, Al.
All right. So here's a good one, and this is actually one that, as I was sitting over there, I was thinking about writing, so somebody was kind of reading my mind a little bit. It speaks to alpha contracting.
Yes.
So why not reinstitute alpha contracting? Contractor, PCO, DCAA, review cost data available to a certain date, and formally submit the proposal or negotiate, certify same time.
Here are the pros of alpha contracting. The pros of alpha contracting is that there is a cooperative environment for people to try to come together and figure out what it costs. Mm-hmm. The fundamental negative of alpha contracting from an audit perspective is that our auditors, if they're involved, are then not really providing an independent view. Right? And we have to have that, right? It's good. The companies typically have, within their own company, they got other people looking at what it is they're doing, not necessarily outside auditors, but independent views. And so we want our auditors to be independent. We want that independent audit view. But there's no reason why the environment that I'm talking about, kind of in a way, you're going to have to figure that out, right? If we're going to work together in modeling techniques, at the end of the day, one of the things that we want to be able to say to companies is, look, it's your cost, it's your product, and you want to model it. You can make it as sophisticated a model as you want or as simple a model as you want. All we really want to know is, when we use the model, whatever it might be, does it result in a reliable outcome? Could you take the data from buy 5, put it in your model, and would it have spit out a cost that looks like buy 6 actually happened? And we can work together. When I talked about fixed and variable costs, that's going to have to be worked between the companies and the government. But we're going to have to be transparent. Right? We're going to have to be, the actual cost is going to have to be provided. And even today, we have situations where we have subcontractors who, quote unquote, refuse to provide actual cost. Well, that's going to change. We just can't be there. Now, if it's a commercial item, no problem. We're not interested in actual cost on commercial items. And we're really not interested necessarily in actual costs in a competitive environment unless you're now the sole source contractor as a result of a competition, then it becomes very important, right? But the alpha concept, or those kinds of techniques, that's kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about a PCO and a pricing professional, DCMA, to a certain degree, DCAA advising, sitting down with the company and saying, okay, what's the cost and pricing data? What does that circle, what's it going to look like? And then that's all the company's going to certify. Right? That's it. And so we get out of the mode of so alpha contracting, to me, where it fell apart was that the outcomes of alpha contracting were not reliable. And what I mean by that, Al, is you'd work out a price for alpha contracting, and you'd say, okay, this is what we think it's going to cost. And then you'd actually look at, well, what happened? And what happened didn't look much like what the alpha contracting process said it was going to look like. And so if the alpha contracting process or any modeling technique that we decide to use, ultimately what we're after is reliable results, right? We say it's going to cost $100, then it ought to be in that ballpark somewhere, 96, 97, 103, 104. It shouldn't be 50, and it shouldn't be 150. Okay.
So this goes back to your comment about the 60-day proposal turnaround. Many contractors use the proposal development period to refine specifications or do detailed designs so as to reduce risk. How is this practice affected by the 60-day proposal turnaround for developmental items?
Well, you know, we can't have it both ways, right? On the one side, we can't have industry saying it takes too long to get under contract, and then on the other side saying, but we need more than 60 days to submit proposals, right? Now, there will be times when, guess what? It is a highly sophisticated proposal in a development process which will require the company to submit a prototype or some type of information that they actually have to develop in the proposal cycle. And those days, those will have to be longer on a case-by-case basis. So I'd say, Al, we should look at that on a case-by-case basis in development. We do want to give the companies sufficient time to submit a reliable, responsive proposal.
Okay. All right.
But I'm talking, when I say 60 days, what I'm talking about is the follow-on, the sustainment environment, things that we pretty much should kind of have a pretty good idea of where we're going.
Okay. Are you encouraging the use of cost estimating relationships or SIRs, parametrics, etc.? These are opportunities to drive time out of the proposal process and or should be used based on past known cost histories.
You know, we kind of have an interesting view of SIRs, right? With some companies, one thing that you can absolutely count on is that the SIRs have absolutely no relationship to anything, right? There are other companies, however, where their SIRs are, in fact, very reliable, very predictive of what things are going to happen. And, what we want to do, I'll give you an example. We have a company on a major program who has about 175 SIRs that they use. But 19 of those SIRs make up 92% of the cost. So is it really necessary to have 165 SIRs if 19 of them make up 92% of the spend or the cost? So what we're trying to do is we have no problem with cost estimating relationships as long as we understand the fixed and variable nature of those costs so that we just don't get into a mode, because it's hard, right? Not everything has a direct relationship. My touch labor is 10 hours and my SIR is 50%, therefore that SIR is 5 hours, right? Well, if you can demonstrate that it's 100% variable, that might make sense. But most support labor, I think all of us would agree, there are very few elements of support labor that are 100% variable. So that SIR, by definition, becomes a complex, right? A complex algebraic equation. So it depends on the nature of the SIR and whether the company can actually demonstrate that there is a legitimate and reliable value to using it.
Okay. Have you considered waiving certification of cost of pricing data for small businesses?
I think it's something that we ought to look at in terms of, remember this idea that I just talked about with trying to figure out what's the appropriate level of cost of pricing data? What is it that we're trying to do?
That's right.
At the end of the day, what we're both trying to do is come up with an accurate forecast of what something is going to cost to do and what is a fair and reasonable profit to make as a result of that. That's what we're trying to do. So what I'm hoping these pilots will do, and I'm glad that you just brought that up, Al, because we will make sure that we do some small business pilots, right? Because if we can figure out a way, the interesting thing about a small business is that many of the folks in a small business are jacks of all trade. I might be the contracting administrator, I'm the estimator, I oversee the maintenance, whatever it might be, you've got to do it, right? And the reality is that it's not like, it could be devastating to a small business if you simply say, well, you got to add 2 more people for estimating. Well, wait a minute, I only got 1 person in my accounting shop, and there are only 10 people in my company. If I have to add 2 people to do estimating, I can't afford that, right? And so, absolutely, Al, we're going to open that door.
All right. You mentioned an acceptable fee being negotiated between contractor PCO. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by acceptable fee?
Yeah,
range?
Yeah. What I'm talking about is, let's say you negotiate a firm fixed price contract and you negotiate a profit rate of 13%, right? Well, what we're telling our contracting officers, well, look, if you're negotiating a cost on that, that cost, if it varies by more than 3 or 4%, there's probably something in the way you estimated it that wasn't quite right, typically. Because when you're dealing with real cost in a company, and I think any company, if you get them to say, they'd say, yeah, you're right. When you're dealing with real cost and you're trying to move that needle a couple of percent, it's hard. It's really hard. So when a company performs and they save a few percent, they've really had to work at it. On the other hand, if you have a contract where you had a projection of $100 and you end up with a cost of $60, that's typically not the result of outstanding performance. Something wasn't right. Right? Something got missed. And so that's where we're at. What we're talking about is the weighted guidelines kind of comes out with a general range, and we're looking, by the way, at that. The weighted guidelines comes out with a general range, says this is kind of where you ought to be. And I think when you talk to most companies, they would agree, yeah, that's kind of a reasonable range to be. And what we're trying to do is make sure when we use firm fixed price contracts that range is respected, right? That there's going to be some variation. We expect there to be variation, but it ought to be, because we're using a firm fixed price contract, it means that we should have known with a lot of certitude where we thought this thing was going to land.
All right, sir. We have time for maybe
Sure.
3 or 4 more. And,
Yep.
Switching gears a little bit, what is your advice to commercial businesses who are new to the government bid process? Any words of wisdom?
Well, it depends what they're bidding on, right? I mean, in some cases, I was just talking to a senior leader in a department who came from the IT world. And he was describing, and he comes from a huge company. He's describing how long it actually took them to get something done, you know, in terms of proposal process and discussion with companies. And surprisingly enough, it wasn't that far off from what it would take us to get it done. You know, it was like, well, actually, the first time it took us 8 or 9 months because we had to get the requirement right. We had to talk to a number of different companies. We had to get a proposal. We had to evaluate it. It took some time. But after that first time, we were able to really reduce it. My own personal experience was, you know, selling a sophisticated, multi-billion-dollar complex system to another commercial company. You know, spending 13, 14, 15 months getting that done was not an unusual event. On the other hand, if you're selling commodities and products, you ought to be able to expect that that's going to get done really quickly, right? You ought to be able to do that. And so my advice to a commercial company is if you have concerns about doing business with us, come in and see us, right? Because I find that most of the time when we talk to commercial companies, we can alleviate their concerns or at least explain to them the process that they're going to be involved in. Because, let's face it, they're commercial companies. They want to sell their products to us, but they really don't want to spend a lot of time in an overhead environment. Okay.
All right. How do you plan to get these changes that you talked about this morning down to the contracting officers? Good to hear the changes from you, but the worker bees are still hungry for any and all cost of pricing data.
Yeah. The reality of life is, Janice will talk to you, I think, a little bit about that today. You know, one of the tools that her team came up with. But we're spending a lot of time with DAU. And where we're going with DAU is we're going to try to change the paradigm a little bit and create many more, I'll call it, compact courses that can enable people to grasp the issue and what we're trying to get at. And that's one of the main reasons why we do peer reviews, Al. You know, we do peer reviews within the department, not just at OSD, but they do them within the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. And they do them so that we can share best practices, mentor our contracting officers, and get the techniques to them immediately. I just did a review yesterday with the Army, and I was elated with the practices and techniques that they were using. It was a textbook of almost everything that we have been talking about, especially over the last 18 months. And so the teams, I see it repeatedly, the teams are getting it. They really are getting it. The difference will be the sea change for all of us is if Congress enables us to do these pilots, and I'm hopeful they will, right? It's certainly in the FMS world we're seeing it, is the difference is going to be, hey, we're going to change the whole environment for what cost and pricing data is, because it'll kind of be unique to any particular procurement. But the proof will be in the pudding. If we're given the permission to do the pilots and we can demonstrate to Congress that they are successful, then I think they'll be open to changing the statute.
Okay. Mr. Assad, thank you for being here. The threshold leap from 750,000 to 2 million was quite substantial. In your opinion, what was the impetus for such a significant change?
Yeah, see, my view is it's in the eyes of the beholder, right? I don't think it for the major procurements that we do, it's not going to have much of an effect. Right. One of the programs we looked at, they had like 300 subcontractors subject to cost of pricing data, and that changed to 296. So that program didn't change very much. But the downside to it is, if you're a pricing professional or a contracting officer at NavSup or down at Warner Robins, or you're at DLA Philadelphia, or DLA Columbus, or DLA Richmond, that's your sweet spot, $750 to $2 million. So, that not being able to get that information puts those folks in a very difficult and uncomfortable environment. So while the data may not have to be certified, I think we're still going to have to get it for them, right? Because they're the ones that, those folks, they're at the tip of the spear. That equipment needs to be bought, and yet they're the ones most often criticized for how could you pay that much for whatever it is that you were buying. And so we've got to find that balance, which is why I'd like to see our pilots go in a different direction. Most for major programs, some for small business, some for these smaller contracts, and see if we can develop. My vision would be that if you were at DLA Richmond, that DLA Richmond would define the cost and pricing data for the products that they buy. And that could be very different than the folks at Wright-Patterson. Right? And that's kind of where we're going, I hope.
All right, sir. Here's one word. It switches LPTA.
Yes, LPTA.
So what is the main direction given to government agencies with regards to LPTA? Is the DoD moving away from LPTA, or is the demand for LPTAs going to increase, in your opinion?
I know of, I've been at around the major procurement world for the last 14 years. And I know of one procurement in 14 years of a major environment that we actually used LPTA. That was the next generation of IT services for the Navy. That was it. We've never ever, I'm not aware of any source selection that we've conducted at a major level where we used LPTA. I think what people are confusing is the importance of price in the overall source selection. When I was on the industrial side, I have to tell you, I was unsuccessful convincing 3 different CEOs that price was not going to be a dominant factor in the source selections that we participated in. No matter what the RFP said, right? They were convinced that I got it, but price is still going to be important. Where we're trying to go in the whole source selection environment, again, to do it in a more compact way, to get things done more efficiently, is to say, look, 80% of the requirements that we've defined, all these companies can do competently. So let's not spend a lot of time trying to distinguish between them. Because at the end of the day, it's very hard to do. And at the end of the day, they're either all blue or they're all green or they're all whatever. Right? Let's focus on what is really important to us. And let's identify those things to industry, and then let's tell them, look, we're willing to pay a premium for these things, but this is all we're willing to pay. And that's not unlike any company that I know of, right? There isn't a never-ending font of money on the industrial side where they say, well, it really doesn't matter what it costs. You know, it's got this advantage, we want it. No, that's kind of not what they do. They're dealing with shareholders' money. It's not their money. We're dealing with taxpayers' money. It's not our money. It's all of our money, but it's every taxpayer in this country's money, right? Not just ours. And so where we're trying to go is become more focused on what's important, take the things that are not important, and just deal with them. Say, look, if you can do these things, that's great. We're going to consider you acceptable or not acceptable. You see these 5 things? This is what's really important. And this is what's going to distinguish you in this competition. So we get the companies focused on the things that are really important to us, and they're not spending a lot of money doing things which we know they can do. Right? I used to chuckle about when we did the tanker competition. We had this incredible past performance evaluation, 100 contracts from each company. And at the end of the day, we viewed both companies about the same. And then when we stepped back from it, we said, gee, you know, was there really any question that either of these 2 companies could build a big plane? Right? And so what we're trying to do is get away from those things that we think at the end of the day aren't going to make a difference to us, either because experience tells us all the companies can do this in the competitive evaluation that we're going to have, or we just don't value it. Right? If they can meet it, that's great. That's all we really want. And these are the things that are really important. So the LPTA thing is, when you talk to a company and they're buying a service, they typically don't pay any more than they have to for it. They don't like to do that. Companies don't like to do it. And so I often scratch my head and say, well, I don't get it. If it was your money, you wouldn't spend any more than you have to get a particular product or service at a particular level of service that you wanted. So why should we? So I'm not a proponent of LPTA as a general tool. Let's use it as often as we can. Okay. To me, it is another tool in the toolbox. It is a best value criterion, as much as people don't like to admit that it is. It is. Mm-hmm. And where the military departments or the defense agencies believe it's the appropriate technique to use, I'm all for it.
Yes, sir.
Okay?
I think the big question for today, are the Red Sox going to be okay this year?
The Red Sox have got a problem. They're called the New York Yankees. And right. So we'll see how that all works.
Well, thank you so much, listen, sir.
Everybody. Let me just say this, if I could, Al.
Yes, sir.
Look, the reason I come here is because I have a tremendous amount of respect for the pricing profession. And the reality to me is, if you're going to be a world-class contracting officer, you have to have pricing skills. And as a minimum, you have to have pricing professionals who are intimate key members of your team, right? Because it takes a team to get this stuff done. Yes, sir. We're trying to make a dramatic change. We're not trying to change things just a little bit. We're trying to change them in a remarkable way. And we have outstanding leadership who is supporting us in that regard. And so we've got an opportunity, and my job is to make sure that we take advantage of it.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.